Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. Reynard stood at the edge of the battlefield, his armor caked in mud and blood. The smell of death lingered in the air, clinging to him like the sweat under his helmet. His sword, forged from obsidian and darker than the blackest night, hummed in his grip. It had been quiet lately, as though sated by the blood it had already spilled. Yet Reynard knew it was only a matter of time before it craved more. The land before him was littered with the bodies of rebels, men and women who had dared to defy the Empire. Their ragged banners, once fluttering with the symbols of hope, now lay trampled under the feet of his knight. This rebellion had been crushed, just like the others, but unlike before, something gnawed at Reynard's soul. He sheathed the sword, its weight pulling at his side like a constant reminder of its presence. The weapon had been a gift from the Emperor himself, a reward for his victories and loyalty. The day he had received it was etched in his memory, a moment of pride. Now that memory felt distant, clouded by a creeping doubt that made his stomach churn. "Commander," a voice called from behind him. Reynard turned to see Dora, his former squire and now one of his captains. She looked as battle-worn as he felt, her short-cropped hair matted with sweat. Her face, usually calm and measured, now showed traces of concern. She was one of the few who still dared to question him. "The field is ours," she said, her tone clipped but respectful. "But the men, they were uneasy." Reynard frowned, uneasy. "They should be celebrating our victory." "They are, but yes, sir, the way we want, sir. They say." She hesitated, her eyes briefly flicking to the sword at his side. "They say you've been different since you took up that blade." Reynard's hand instinctively moved to the hilt, gripping it tightly. "Different. I've done what I've always done, protected the Empire. If the men questioned that, perhaps they've forgotten their duty." Dara straightened, her gaze hardening. "No one questions your loyalty, Commander, least of all me. But we've always fought with honor. The things you've done recently, they were not the man I trained under." Reynard bristled, stepping closer to her. "You think I've lost my honor? You think the men we killed today were deserving of it? They were rebels, Dora. Traitors. They would have burned our homes and slaughtered our people if given the chance." "Maybe," she said, holding his gaze, "but that doesn't mean we should become the monsters we're refighting." Her words struck him like a physical blow, and for a moment, he felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He opened his mouth to argue, to tell her that he hadn't changed, that the sword had only made him stronger. But deep down, something stopped him. A small voice buried beneath layers of anger and pride whispered that she was right. Without another word, Reynard turned and walked away, leaving Dora standing in the field of corpses. The obsidian sword had been forged for a purpose, though. What that purpose was, Reynard could not say. It had been a gift from the Emperor after his victory in the Northern Territories, a token of appreciation for his loyalty and service. But from the moment his hand had wrapped around the hilt, he had felt its pull. At first, it had been subtle, a quiet whisper in the back of his mind, a suggestion that perhaps mercy was a luxury he could no longer afford. Over time, the whisper grew louder, turning into a roar that drowned out his thoughts, driving him to act with increasing brutality. His victories became more decisive, but so did the body count. He had told himself it was necessary. The Empire was facing threats from all sides: rebellions, uprisings, foreign invaders. The sword had given him the power to crush these threats, swiftly and completely. But now, standing alone in his tent with the weapon lying across his table, like a sleeping beast he couldn't touch, the feeling that he was losing control. The flap of the tent rustled, and Reynard looked up to see Dora enter. She moved with purpose, her face set in grim determination. "We need to talk," she said, not bothering with formality. Reynard gestured for her to sit, though he doubted she would. She remained standing, her arms crossed over her chest, eyes locked on the sword. "You've said enough today, Captain," Reynard replied, trying to keep his voice calm. "I don't need another lecture." "This isn't a lecture," she said, stepping closer. "It's a warning. I spoke with Edred." Reynard's brow furrowed. "The Major, what does that old fool have to do with it?" "He knows about the sword," Dara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He says it's cursed." Reynard laughed, though the sound was hollow. "Cursed, it sends a weapon. Dara, nothing more, a tool like any other sword." Dara shook her head. He says it was forged by dark magic, from a time before the Empire. It corrupts whoever wields it, feeding on their anger, their desire for power. You read not yourself, Reynard, the things you've done, ... It sent the sword. Reynard stood, anger flaring in his chest. "I've done what needed to be done. I've brought peace to this land. I've crushed the enemies of the Empire, and you think that some curse of some curse. I think it's changed you, Dora said, her voice firm. You are not the man I once knew. For a moment, Reynard said nothing. He wanted to shout to tell her she was wrong, that he was still the same knight who had trained her, the same man who had sworn to protect the Empire at all costs. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he looked at the sword, its black surface gleaming in the dim light of the tent. Could she be right? I am leaving tomorrow, Dara said, breaking the silence. I am going to find Edric. He says there may be a way to destroy the sword to break its hold on you. Reynard said, head snapped up, fury igniting in his eyes. You will do no such thing. The sword is mine, and I won. Tree, have you meddling in affairs? You don't understand. You're not yourself, Reynard, she repeated, her voice soft but unyielding. You're not. He took a step toward her, his hand unconsciously moving to the hilt of the sword. Go back to your quarters, Captain. That's an order. For a long moment they stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills. Then, without another word, Dara turned and left the tent. The night was cold, and the stars above seemed distant, barely visible through the heavy cloud. Reynard couldn't sleep. Dara's words could gnaw at him, unsettling his mind. He had always been so sure of himself, so certain of the path he walked. But now, for the first time in years, he felt doubt creeping into his heart. He had been a knight of the Empire for as long as he could remember. His entire life had been dedicated to serving the crown, to defending the people. But what if Dora was right? What if the sword had corrupted him, twisted his sense of justice into something darker? Reynard stood and walked over to the table where the sword lay. He picked it up, feeling the familiar weight in his hand. It felt right, like it belonged there. But as he held it, he felt something else, a pulse, like a heartbeat. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, thrumming through the hilt and into his palm. The sword was alive. Reynard dropped it, stumbling back as if burned. He stared at the weapon, his heart pounding in his chest. How had he not noticed before? How had he ignored the sign? The sword whispered to him, its voice soft but insistent. Pick me up. Reynard shook his head, backing away. Pick me up. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the voice, but it was everywhere, inside his mind, inside his very soul. You need me. He fell to his knees, clutching his head. The voice grew louder, more demanding. Pick me up. Reynard's hand twitched, reaching toward the sword of its own accord. He fought against it, but the pull was too strong. His fingers wrapped around the hilt, and the moment they touched the obsidian surface, the voice stopped. A strange calm washed over him, and for the first time in days his mind felt clear. He stood, the sword hanging loosely in his grip. It didn't hum or pulse anymore. It was silent, waiting. Reynard looked around the tent, his eyes cold and calculating. He knew what he had to do. Reynard emerged from his tent before dawn, his knights still slumbering in their makeshift camp. The obsidian sword hung at his side, a constant presence, but now it felt different. It no longer pulled at him, no longer whispered in his ear. Instead, it lay quiet, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. He would make sure it served his purpose, not the other way around. Dara was gone. She had left in the night, no doubt seeking out that fool mage Edric. Reynard's jaw tightened at the thought of it, but he pushed the anger down. It didn't matter. She would fail. No one could destroy the sword. It was too powerful, too ancient. But her disobedience still gnawed at him. He would have to deal with her soon enough. His thoughts turned to the Emperor. The orders to cease his campaign and return to the capital had been delivered 2 days ago, and Reynard had yet to respond. He knew what was expected of him, but he also knew the Emperor didn't understand what was at stake. The rebels had been subdued, yes, but there were whispers of more uprisings, deeper plots against the throne. The Empire needed someone like Reynard, someone willing to do what was necessary to maintain order, to protect the people from themselves. As he mounted his horse, Reynard's gaze swept across the camp. His knights would follow him anywhere. They had seen what he could do, seen the power he wielded with the obsidian sword. Some feared him. He knew, but fear was just another tool. It kept them loyal. It kept them focused on the task at hand. Without waiting for anyone to stir, Reynard spurred his horse toward the capital. The road to the capital was long, winding through dense forests and across windswept plain. Reynard rode in silence, his mind filled with thoughts of what was to come. The Emperor would demand answers. demand that he relinquish the sword and submit to imperial authority. But Reynard had already made his decision. The emperor was weak, unwilling to take the steps necessary to secure the empire's future. It was time for a new order, one where strength and power ruled, not politics. By the time he reached the capital, as outskirts, the sky was darkening with the approach of dusk. The city loomed before him, its towering walls and spires outlined against the fading light. He could feel the tension in the air, a kind of anticipation, as if the city itself knew something was about to change. Reynard dismounted and approached the city gates. The guards stationed there stiffened as they recognized him, but they didn't move to stop him. They knew better. He walked past them without a word, his steps echoing on the cobblestone. The palace rose at the heart of the city, an imposing structure of stone and steel. Reynard's boots clanged against the metal floors as he strode through the grand halls, ignoring the courtiers and servants who scurried out of his way. He could feel the weight of the sword at his side, heavier now, as though sensing the moment had arrived. The throne room doors opened before him, and there at the far end of the hall sat the emperor. He was a young man, barely out of his 20s, but already his face showed the signs of worry and exhaustion that came with ruling an empire. His eyes flicked to the sword as Reynard approached, a glint of unease flashing across his features. "Reynard," the emperor began, his voice calm but firm. "You were summoned days ago. Why have you not obeyed?" Reynard stopped a few paces from the throne, his expression unreadable. "I was securing the empire's borders. Your Majesty, I did what needed to be done." The emperor's gaze hardened. "You went too far. The reports from the field, whole villages wiped out, prisoners executed without trial. These are not the actions of a knight sworn to protect the people." "The people were rebels," Reynard replied, his voice low but steady, traitors to the crown. "They deserve no mercy." "Mercy is not for you to decide," the emperor snapped. "You are a knight, not a judge." Reynard's hand moved to the hilt of the sword, resting there lightly. "This sword has shown me what is necessary. You can truly lead this empire with kindness and diplomacy. It takes strength, real strength, to keep the peace." The emperor's eyes narrowed. "You speak as if you know better than the crown." "I do," Reynard said, the words falling from his lips before he could stop them. "This sword has given me the power to do what you cannot." The emperor rose from his throne, his hand gripping the scepter at his side. "You dare speak against your emperor. You were given that sword to serve the empire, not to defy it." Reynard's grip on the sword tightened, and for a moment the room seemed to darken. The air grew heavy, oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in. The sword pulsed in his hand, its dark power surging through him, filling him with a sense of invincibility. "The empire needs a leader who can wield real power," Reynard said, his voice cold and steady. "Someone who isn't afraid to make the hard decision." The emperor's face twisted with anger. "You would betray me, betray the crown." "I would save the empire," Reynard replied. In one swift motion, the emperor raised his scepter, and the room was suddenly filled with the sound of metal clashing against metal. Guards poured in from every doorway, their swords drawn, encircling Reynard. "Arrest him," the emperor commanded. Reynard's hand shot to the obsidian sword, and in an instant it was drawn. The blade gleamed with a dark, malevolent light, and the guards hesitated, their eyes wide with fear. "Stay back," Reynard warned, his voice deadly calm. "I don't want to kill you." But the guards moved forward, their loyalty to the crown outweighing their fear. Reynard's grip tightened, and in a blur of motion, he struck. The obsidian blade cut through the air with terrifying speed, slicing through armor and flesh as though it were paper. The guards fell one by one, their blood pooling on the floor, staining the pristine marble beneath his feet. The emperor watched in horror, his face pale as his elite guard was cut down before his eyes. "Reynard, stop this madness." But Reynard could no longer hear him. The sword had taken over, its power coursing through him like fire. He moved with inhuman speed, cutting down anyone who dared to approach him. The once great knight was now a whirlwind of death, his sword singing as it sliced through the air. When the last of the guards fell, Reynard turned to the emperor, his chest heaving with exertion, the sword pulsed in his hand, hungry for more. "You've lost your way," the emperor said, his voice trembling. "This isn't the man I once trusted." Reynard raised the sword, his eyes cold and unfeeling. "The empire needs a new leader." The Emperor's eyes widened as Reynard brought the sword down. But before the blow could land, a flash of light filled the room, and Reynard was thrown back, the sword flying from his hand. He hit the ground hard, his vision swimming as he tried to get to his feet. When the light faded, Edrin stood in the center of the room, his staff glowing with a soft, ethereal light. Dara stood beside him, her sword drawn, her face set in grim determination. "It's done. Over Reynard," Dara said, stepping forward. "You can too whip." Reynard struggled to his feet, his body aching from the impact. His hand reached for the sword, but it was just out of reach. "You read too late," he growled, his eyes blazing with fury. "The sword is mine. The Empire is mine." Adrian stepped forward, his eyes filled with sorrow. "The sword is not yours, Reynard. It never was. It's been using you, feeding on your anger, your fear. Let it go." Reynard shook his head, his hand still reaching for the sword. "I can take it too late." Dara moved closer, her sword at the ready. "It's not too late. You can still stop this. You can still make things right." For a moment, Reynard hesitated. He looked at Dara, at the woman he had trained, the woman who had always stood by his side. He looked at Idrin the mage, who had warned him of the sword's power. And then he looked at the sword, lying on the ground, its dark surface gleaming in the dim light of the throne room. He could feel its pull. Even now it called to him, whispered to him, promised him power beyond imagining. But in that moment, Reynard realized the truth. The power the sword offered was an illusion. It had never been his to control. It had controlled him. With a deep breath, Reynard stepped back, his hand falling away from the sword. "It's Sangvar," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Dara lowered her sword, relief flooding her face. Adrin moved forward, his staff glowing once more as he muttered an incantation. The obsidian sword began to crack its surface, splitting apart as the magic holding it together unraveled. With a final shudder, the sword shattered into 1,000 pieces, its dark power vanishing into the air. Reynard collapsed to his knees, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. He had been a hero once, a protector of the Empire, but now he was nothing more than a man who had lost his way. Dara knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's sent over, Reynard. You refree." But as Reynard looked around the blood-soaked throne room at the bodies of the men he had once called comrades, he knew that freedom had come at a terrible cost.